I don't remember deciding to become this way. I don't remember a moment when I chose to put everyone else first, or when I consciously decided that my feelings would always come second. It wasn't a decision. It was a slow adjustment, one that felt harmless at the time. I learned early how disappointment worked. I learned the tone people used when they were let down. The silence that followed unmet expectations. The subtle shift in how they looked at you when you failed to be what they hoped. I didn't want that look. So I learned how to avoid it. I became attentive. I noticed what people needed before they asked. I learned how to agree without fully committing, how to adapt without resisting, how to make myself useful without being seen as demanding. People liked that. They called me kind, thoughtful, easy to be around. I didn't realize that easy was becoming my entire identity. At first, it felt good to be needed. To be the person others could rely on. The one who didn't complicate things, who didn't add weight to the room, who absorbed tension instead of creating it. I told myself that was maturity. I told myself that this is how adults behave, by managing themselves, by not making everything about how they feel. And maybe that's partly true. But somewhere along the way, management turned into erasure. I stopped noticing when something bothered me. Or rather, I noticed, and immediately dismissed it. I trained myself to downplay discomfort before it could become visible, even to me. It was automatic. A reflex. Someone needed something, I adjusted. Someone expected something, I complied. Someone might be disappointed, I prevented it. I didn't ask whether I wanted to. I asked whether it would upset anyone if I didn't. That question shaped my life. Major decisions came with the same internal calculation: who will this affect? Who might feel hurt? Who might be let down? My own feelings rarely made the list. Not because I thought they didn't matter, but because including them felt selfish. Excessive. Unnecessary. I became very good at explaining myself in ways that made others comfortable. I learned how to frame my choices so they sounded reasonable, considerate, harmless. Over time, those explanations replaced honesty. I started choosing what would keep the peace rather than what felt true. I told myself that harmony was more important than authenticity, that relationships required compromise. What I didn't see was that I was the only one constantly compromising. People didn't ask me to disappear. I volunteered. And because I did it quietly, politely, without complaint, no one noticed. Including me. I didn't feel unhappy in an obvious way. There was no dramatic dissatisfaction. My life functioned. I had connections. I was involved. I was appreciated. But there was a subtle, persistent fatigue that never left. Not physical. Existential. The kind of tiredness that comes from constantly monitoring yourself, constantly adjusting your internal volume so it never disrupts the room. I remember moments when I wanted to say no, and didn't. Moments when I felt overwhelmed, and smiled. Moments when something inside me resisted, and I overruled it without hesitation. Those moments didn't feel significant individually. But they accumulated. And slowly, something inside me went quiet. I noticed it when people asked me what I wanted. Not in a deep sense, casually, conversationally. And I felt a pause that shouldn't have been there. I had answers ready for what made sense. But not for what I wanted. I told myself that wanting less made me flexible. Adaptable. Strong. I didn't realize it was making me absent. I was present in other people's lives. In their needs, their expectations, their emotional landscapes. I wasn't present in my own. I had become an expert at not disappointing others, and a stranger to myself. That realization didn't come as a breakdown. It came as a quiet discomfort I couldn't explain away. A sense that my life was happening around me, and I was maintaining it rather than living it. And once that thought appeared, it refused to leave. If I have spent my entire life making sure no one else is disappointed, who has been carrying the disappointment I never allowed myself to express? Once that question settled in me, who has been carrying the disappointment I never allowed myself to express? I tried to ignore it. I treated it like an intrusive thought. Something brought on by fatigue. Something that would disappear if I stayed busy enough, useful enough, needed enough. So I did what I always did. I gave more. More time. More attention. More understanding. I became even better at anticipating what others wanted before they had to say it. I smoothed over conflicts. I absorbed tension. I said yes when I wanted to say no, and I convinced myself it didn't matter. It always mattered. I just didn't let myself feel it. The strange thing about living this way is that no one is actively taking advantage of you. People aren't cruel. They're just responding to the version of you that's always available. Always accommodating. Always fine. You teach them who you are. And I had taught everyone that I didn't require much. I started noticing how often my body reacted before my mind allowed anything through. A tightness in my chest when I agreed to something I didn't want. A dull pressure behind my eyes during conversations where I was pretending to be more enthusiastic than I felt. A heaviness that followed me home after social situations where I had performed attentiveness for hours. I told myself it was normal. That everyone feels drained sometimes. But this wasn't just tiredness. It was depletion. I realized I never felt restored by people, only emptied. Even with those I cared about. Even in relationships that were warm and supportive. I was always giving, always adjusting, always monitoring myself. I didn't know how to just be. Being required less effort for others. For me, it felt almost unsafe. I started to see how deeply I feared disappointing people. Not because they would punish me, but because disappointment felt like abandonment. Like proof that my value was conditional. If I stopped meeting expectations, would I still be wanted? That fear lived quietly underneath everything I did. I had learned early that approval came from being agreeable. That affection followed usefulness. That being low maintenance made you easier to keep. So I became easy to keep. And impossible to know. I couldn't remember the last time I had said something honest that might have unsettled the room. I couldn't remember the last time I had allowed myself to be inconvenient, or emotional, or unsure. I had trained myself out of visibility. That realization hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. Because it meant that my exhaustion wasn't accidental. It was structural. Built into the way I lived, the way I related, the way I understood my place in the world. I had organized my entire life around not causing discomfort. Including my own. I began to wonder what would happen if I stopped. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just, what if I didn't immediately fix things? What if I let someone be disappointed? The thought alone made my stomach tighten. I imagined the silence. The awkwardness. The shift in energy. I imagined people pulling away, reevaluating me, deciding I was no longer worth the effort. That fear kept me compliant. But it also kept me invisible. I started to see that my kindness had become transactional, not because others demanded it, but because I used it to secure belonging. I gave to earn my place. I adapted to avoid rejection. I wasn't being generous. I was being strategic. And that strategy had a cost. I didn't know how to receive. Compliments made me uncomfortable. Care felt conditional. When people offered support, I minimized my needs so they wouldn't feel burdened. I didn't trust that I could be wanted without being useful. That realization cracked something open. Because I saw how lonely that belief was. I had surrounded myself with people, but I had never let them see me without the filter. I had never risked being known instead of being liked. I had mistaken harmony for connection. And harmony, when it's one-sided, becomes silence. I began to feel a quiet anger, not at others, but at myself. For how thoroughly I had abandoned my own experience. For how quickly I dismissed my feelings as less important. For how easily I convinced myself that this was just who I was. But this wasn't personality. It was survival. A pattern that had once protected me, now keeping me stuck. I didn't know how to stop people pleasing. I only knew that continuing like this would eventually leave nothing of me to give. And that scared me more than disappointing anyone ever had. Because for the first time, I understood something clearly: avoiding other people's disappointment had slowly turned into betraying myself. And that betrayal was no longer quiet enough to ignore. The first time I disappointed someone on purpose, nothing collapsed. That surprised me. There was no dramatic fallout, no irreversible damage, no sudden abandonment. There was just a pause. A moment of discomfort. A slight shift in tone. And then, life continued. But inside me, something changed. I realized how much fear I had built around disappointment, as if it were a catastrophe instead of a normal part of being human. As if other people's comfort was my responsibility to protect at all costs. That belief had shaped everything. I had lived as if my role was to absorb friction so others wouldn't have to feel it. To adjust myself so the world stayed smooth. To be agreeable enough that no one ever had to question their expectations. I didn't call it self-sacrifice. I called it being good. But goodness without boundaries isn't virtue. It's erasure. I didn't suddenly become assertive or outspoken. I didn't turn into someone who always puts themselves first. I simply began to notice when I was abandoning myself, and paused. That pause felt terrifying at first. In it lived all the fears I had avoided. What if they're disappointed? What if they pull away? What if I'm less liked? I learned to sit with those questions without immediately fixing them. And slowly, I learned something unexpected. Most disappointment is survivable. It passes. It adjusts. It recalibrates relationships instead of destroying them. What isn't survivable is constant self-betrayal. I began practicing honesty in small, almost invisible ways. Saying, I don't think I can do that. Letting my tone reflect my actual energy. Not over-explaining. Not apologizing for existing outside of expectations. Some people didn't like the change. That hurt. Because it confirmed what I had feared all along. My compliance had been part of the contract. My availability, my flexibility, my willingness to adapt had been part of why I was accepted. Letting go of that meant letting go of certain connections. But those connections had never known me. They had known my usefulness. I also discovered something else. When I stopped overextending myself, space appeared. Emotional space. Mental space. A quiet sense of relief I hadn't felt before. I wasn't constantly scanning the room, anticipating needs, preparing myself to adjust. For the first time, my attention came back to me. I noticed what drained me. I noticed what energized me. I noticed how much of my life had been lived in reaction instead of intention. That awareness wasn't comfortable. It came with grief. Grief for the years I spent trying to be easy instead of real. Grief for the desires I had buried because they might inconvenience someone. Grief for the self I had trained to stay silent. I let that grief exist. I didn't rush to transform it into gratitude or growth or lessons learned. I let it be sadness, honest, quiet, deserved. And in that sadness, something softened. I stopped seeing myself as selfish for wanting things. I stopped viewing my needs as obstacles to harmony. I began to understand that my presence mattered just as much as anyone else's. Not more. Not less. Equal. That was a new concept for me. Equality in emotional space. I didn't have to earn my place by being useful. I didn't have to justify my feelings by proving their necessity. I didn't have to disappear to be loved. That understanding didn't make my life easier. It made it truer. I still care about others. I still value kindness, consideration, empathy. But I no longer use them as reasons to silence myself. I no longer confuse being good with being invisible. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, the one who says yes too quickly, who minimizes themselves to keep the peace, who carries everyone else's comfort while quietly exhausting their own, I want you to hear this clearly: you are not selfish for having limits. You are not cruel for disappointing people. You are not wrong for wanting to be seen. Disappointment is part of relationship. Self-erasure should not be. I lived most of my life trying not to disappoint anyone. In doing so, I disappointed myself every single day. Learning to stop didn't come from becoming louder or harder or more demanding. It came from one simple shift. I stopped asking, will this upset someone? And started asking, can I live with myself if I don't say this? That question changed how I move through the world. Not perfectly. But honestly. And for the first time, that honesty feels like home.